When a sharp-tongued TV host set his sights on Usha Vance, he never imagined her poised comeback would leave him reeling. Spotlights blazed across the gleaming studio set, the bright stage reflecting the high-stakes tension of a live broadcast. Usha Vance, elegant yet unassuming, prepared for what she thought would be a standard political quanda. Little did she know, the host had a different plan in mind, one that would test her composure in front of millions. Usha had been in media circles many times before, often appearing beside her husband, Senator J.D. Vance, during campaign stops and public events. Yet this invitation felt different. The host, a celebrated liberal commentator known for catching his guests off guard, had personally requested her presence. There was an undercurrent of sensation in the air as the camera zoomed in on Usha's composed face. She wore a midnight blue suit jacket over a crisp white blouse, and her hair was neatly pinned back, an outward sign of her characteristic self-discipline. Her posture was perfectly aligned, revealing nothing of the subtle anticipation swirling inside her. The show opened with its usual flair, the theme music, the revolving graphics, and then the host appeared under the bright lights, a confident grin spreading across his face. "Welcome to tonight's special segment," he began, voice brimming with polished charisma. "We have with us someone who has navigated the corridors of power, both in the legal world and in politics. A highly regarded Yale-educated attorney and the wife of Senator J.D. Vance. Please join me in welcoming Usha Vance." A polite round of applause followed, though the tension was palpable. The studio audience, a hand-picked crowd that often leaned left politically, watched with rapt attention, poised for any moment of drama. The cameras swung to Usha, capturing her subtle smile. She nodded a greeting to the host, whose eyes glinted with a mixture of curiosity and challenge. She offered a cordial, "Thank you for having me," though her tone was measured. Usha was always careful. She had learned early on that every word on live television could be twisted or replayed endlessly. Even so, she felt she could handle whatever the host might throw her way. For the first few minutes, the interview ambled through familiar territory. They talked about her legal background, her perspective on Ohio's shifting political climate, and her passion for education reforms that benefited underserved communities. Usha seemed at ease, her voice steady, her replies thoughtful. Cameras panned across the audience, capturing nods of approval. But when the host pivoted, the shift in his demeanor was immediate. He angled forward, placed both elbows on his desk as if preparing to pounce, and asked, "So let's get to the heart of the matter. What's it really like being married to J.D. Vance? And be honest, do you ever regret it, given his controversial stances?" The words fell like a thunderclap. Usha could hear a faint gasp from someone in the front row. The question reverberated around the stage, cracking the polite veneer that had held the interview together so far. Usha's eyes flickered, but her face betrayed nothing. She stayed silent, letting the tension spiral. The host's self-satisfied smirk hovered on his lips. He must have thought he had cornered her with the ultimate gotcha question. After all, if she faltered, it would be headline gold. Political spouse hesitates to defend her marriage on live TV. He waited, expecting hesitation or a scramble to redirect. Instead, all he got was an unwavering gaze that left the audience silent. Silence can be a host's best friend or his worst enemy. This time it turned on him. The studio lights felt harsher, amplified by the hush enveloping the audience. Even the camera operators tensed, anticipating a moment that could go viral. Usha finally broke the silence with a calm exhale. "Regret?" she repeated, keeping her voice unshaken. "That's a strong word." Her reaction wasn't typical. Most political spouses facing a loaded question might stammer or laugh nervously, attempting to brush it aside. But Usha leaned forward, meeting the host's expectant look. "I married JD because I respect him, I love him, and we share core values." She paused again, letting the words sink in. "When someone asks if I regret that, it implies I should be questioning the entirety of my marriage for the sake of a political headline." A ripple of approval, almost inaudible, traveled through part of the audience. The host looked slightly taken aback but feigned a confident chuckle. "I'm not trying to question your entire marriage," he insisted, though his grin contradicted that claim. "I just think the public is curious about how certain ideological disagreements might affect your relationship." Usha nodded, still calm. "Curiosity is fine, but let's be real. We rarely see men asked if they regret marrying women whose opinions differ from mainstream expectations. Yet here we are, having that conversation about me. Would you have asked Michelle Obama if she regretted marrying Barack, even though his positions attracted controversy?" A few scattered claps broke out, And the host's cheeks reddened. He tried to regain control. I assure you, this isn't about gender. It's about your husband's far-right views, which some say are harmful to... Some say, Usha interrupted smoothly, but many also believe in his message about working-class Americans feeling left behind. We can debate policy, but I find it interesting that you jump straight to personal regret. Do you ask every politician's spouse whether they feel regret, or just the ones you disagree with? Her voice carried no hostility, just a pointed observation, which made it all the more devastating. The audience shifted, uncertain whether to applaud or hold their breath. The host stiffened in his seat. He was used to controlling the narrative, prodding his guests into missteps or admissions. But she was too quick, too sharp. Look, the host said, forcing a genial smile, we're just trying to get an honest sense of your emotional journey. It can't be easy being married to someone always in the crosshairs of media and political opponents. Usha tilted her head as if considering his words. It isn't always easy, but marriage rarely is, political or not. People who get married for love and respect face challenges no matter what. But to ask me if I regret my marriage because certain commentators dislike my husband's positions, that's a narrative I'm not willing to validate. The conversation had started as a routine interview, but was morphing into a much larger commentary on bias, relationships, and double standards. The host's expression hardened. He glanced at the teleprompter as if searching for support. There was none. The producers sat behind the glass window, whispering frantically into headsets, uncertain whether to cut to a break or let this exchange ride. High drama brought ratings, after all. He forged ahead. So you're saying that any critique of your husband's policies is automatically a double standard? Not at all, Usha clarified. Critique him all you want. JD welcomes debate. What I find interesting is directing that critique at our marriage. It's like you're suggesting that because his views might be unpopular in certain circles, I should somehow apologize for being his wife. Her words were calm, but the punch landed. The host swallowed. On social media, there would be little doubt that hashtags about Usha Vance schooling the host were already forming. The crowd wasn't hostile to him, but they felt the electric shift in the conversation. A few murmured agreement with Usha's stance. Even some who disliked J.D. Vance politically could see how this question wasn't purely about policy, but a personal jab. The host tried to pivot. All right, then let's talk about the day-to-day reality. Politics is so polarized these days. How do you reconcile your career, your own beliefs, and your husband's public positions? Usha leaned back slightly, crossing her legs with a certain ease that suggested she had nothing to hide. It's called communication and mutual respect. We are two professionals with distinct viewpoints, and we don't always agree on everything. But we align on core principles, caring about families, encouraging economic growth in struggling regions, fostering a culture of responsibility. Do we differ on specifics sometimes? Sure. But that's true of countless marriages. Ours just happens to play out under a very public microscope. The host saw an opening. You mentioned specifics. Can you point to a policy stance of his that you disagree with? Usha smiled politely, aware of the trap. My policy discussions with my husband happen in private, and we value each other's counsel. I'm not here to sell him out for a headline. If he wants my opinion, he gets it. But I don't owe that to the general public. He nodded, though a flicker of frustration crossed his eyes. He changed tactics again, flipping through his notes as if searching for something more incendiary. Perhaps he thought he'd glean a divisive or shocking statement, but she was already steps ahead. She had been trained in high-pressure legal scenarios, schooled in the fine art of measured responses. If he intended to box her in, he'd have to do better. A few feet from the host's desk sat a row of television monitors, each angled to capture the best view of the guest, the host, and the audience. In one feed, Usha could see herself, calmly returned to a neutral posture, unthreatening yet unyielding. She took a quick glance around the studio, noticing the slight tension in the stage manager's stance, the hush among the audience. The host tried a new angle. You're a successful attorney, a Yale graduate, a woman with her own accomplishments. Have you ever felt overshadowed by your husband's political persona? A subtle smirk tugged at the corner of Usha's lips. Overshadowed? No. My career path existed long before his Senate run. When we're home, we're just JD and Usha, partners who help each other grow. Our achievements aren't in competition, they're complementary. So no, I don't feel overshadowed, I feel supported. There it was again, a clean, direct answer that gave him no sensational tidbit to exploit. The host's smirk faltered. He pressed on. Still, your husband's viewpoints often spark controversy. Many have branded him as too extreme or opportunistic. Don't you think that could damage your personal brand, especially in legal circles where progressive values dominate? The audience sensed the aggression in that question, but Usha maintained her poise. I made peace with who I am a long time ago. Whether I practice law or not, I stand by my beliefs. People can think what they want about my personal life, but my legal work speaks for itself. If a firm or a colleague judges me solely because of my husband's stances, then they're missing the point of individual autonomy. A brief applause broke out. The host plastered on a showman's grin, as if to mask his growing irritation. So you're not worried about backlash or reputational harm? She shrugged lightly. We live in a free society with free expression. Of course, people will talk, but I choose my path, not them. And if that path includes being married to someone they find controversial, well, that's their problem, not mine. The dynamic was mesmerizing. Many in the audience had come expecting a standard quanda sprinkled with mild controversy, but they were witnessing something far more riveting. Usha was conducting a master class in how to address baited questions without losing her cool. The host, meanwhile, was starting to look like he was wading through quicksand. His carefully laid snare was falling apart. Each attempt to corner her only highlighted her calm defiance. He took a moment to fix his papers, trying to project calm. Let's switch gears. A while back, there were reports, unconfirmed of course, that you and JD had substantial disagreements regarding healthcare legislation. Some insiders claimed you privately urged him to vote differently. Care to shed light on that? Usha offered a patient smile. You're right to say unconfirmed. We discuss policy in private. I'm not going to disclose every conversation we have. That's our marriage. We value open dialogue behind closed doors. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't. That's normal. He pressed, but the public has a right to know if the senator's spouse is influencing his decisions. She arched a brow. The public has a right to representation and transparency about official policies. They do not have a right to every intimate detail of a married couple's discussions. Or do you believe your viewers need transcripts of every conversation you have at home? A swell of laughter and applause erupted from parts of the audience. The host had walked right into that, and the reaction in the room made it clear that many people saw the double standard. He cleared his throat. Fair enough, he managed with a controlled grin. I suppose privacy is still a thing, even in politics. There was a flicker of discomfort on his face as he shifted to another set of notes, but Usha watched him calmly. Every question seemed designed to pry an admission of doubt or regret. She understood that media thrives on conflict, especially conflict within political marriages. If she so much as hinted she was troubled by JD's stances, the storyline would write itself. Her presence here was never about policy. It was about framing the narrative that the Vances were internally conflicted, that she was regretting her life choices. The next question arrived with calculated politeness. From your perspective, do you feel your husband's beliefs truly serve the best interests of all Americans? Or does he focus too narrowly on the Rust Belt issues he's known for championing? She recognized the attempt to pit her against him. JD cares about Ohio, that's where we come from. But he's also on committees and discussions that affect the entire country. Focusing on the Rust Belt first doesn't mean neglecting the rest. It's about raising those who've been overlooked. And you find no contradiction between his populist rhetoric and the fact that he's now part of the establishment he once criticized? A subtle edge sharpened in Usha's tone, though she never raised her voice. Being elected doesn't suddenly turn you into an unthinking cog in the system. Critique from within can be more meaningful. And if you're suggesting that once someone's in office, they can't maintain genuine convictions, that says more about your assumption of cynicism than it does about him. The host drummed his fingers on the desk, sending a signal that he was impatient. Maybe he sensed the audience leaning toward Usha's authenticity. The game he had scripted wasn't playing out in his favor. All right, Miss Vance, let's circle back to the main question. You're telling our viewers that you have never once, even for a second, regretted marrying a man with strong, controversial views that might cause you professional or social setbacks. The question lingered in the air, a final shot. Usha leaned in. Never once, she affirmed. Because love and respect are not conditional on public opinion. We don't pick our partners based on the likelihood of unanimous approval. We pick them based on shared values, loyalty, and a willingness to grow together. That's my choice, and it's one I stand by completely. A hush took over the studio. The host opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out immediately. He blinked, flipping to a blank page in his notes. It was clear he had no more pointed questions left, or perhaps he realized continuing down that path risked seeming petty. The tension that had fueled the interview began to dissolve, replaced by a mix of admiration, relief, and maybe a trace of disappointment from those who'd wanted more fireworks. Some scattered applause rose. A few members of the audience stood clapping for Usha, though it wasn't a standing ovation for the entire studio. It was enough to show that her authenticity, her refusal to be rattled, resonated with many. She shifted in her seat, exhaling quietly, but her posture remained upright, her gaze firmly on the host. He glanced off camera, possibly receiving a signal from his producers. The host gave a tight smile. "Well, Mrs. Vance, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. I appreciate your candid responses, and I guess we can wrap up by asking, is there anything you want to tell the American people about who you are, outside of politics?" Usha's gaze softened, her voice taking on a warmth that felt genuine. "Yes, I'm someone who believes in family, in public service, in the power of empathy. People might assume I'm just a politician's wife, but I'm also an attorney who's fought for families in court, who believes in justice and who stands firmly on my own feet. I love my husband and I stand by him, but I also stand by my own convictions. That's it." The host nodded curtly. "Understood. Thank you for joining us tonight, Mrs. Vance. This interview has been illuminating." He turned toward the camera, forced brightness in his voice. "We'll be right back after a short break. Stay tuned." As the final question landed, Usha sensed the interview nearing its conclusion. The stage lights flickered briefly, signifying the countdown to commercial. The host exhaled, the tension on his face betraying how carefully he had attempted to corner her. She offered a polite nod, thanking him for inviting her, maintaining her collected demeanor. A stagehand signaled cut, and the large studio monitors went dark for a moment. The audience, slow to react, began a polite applause. A few turned to each other, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Usha slowly uncrossed her legs and stood, smoothing her skirt. She extended a handshake toward the host, who accepted, though his smile carried the faint exhaustion of a competitor who knew he'd lost a decisive round. "Well," he said, leaning in so only she could hear, "I've got to hand it to you. You handled yourself well." "Thank you," she replied, a small, gracious smile lifting the corners of her mouth. Then she walked toward the edge of the stage, the overhead light still beaming brightly against the polished floor. A production assistant came up to guide her off set. As she left, she could feel multiple pairs of eyes following her. She heard the low murmur of studio chatter, the rustle of camera equipment being repositioned. It was the kind of post-show flurry she had experienced before, but this time, it felt different. There was a weight in the air, an acknowledgement that a supposedly routine interview had turned into something more significant. Yet Usha didn't dwell on it. She kept moving, stepping off the raised platform and onto the backstage carpet. The interview was over. She had made her point. There was nothing more to say.